properly, it's properly landscaped accordingly, and it's behind what it needs to be. Screen, yeah. So, anyway, it's to kind of save time, because we've already been through this, kind of jump into that punch to see if that's maybe where we want to head, because it would be very easy then, because we're not gonna be adopting anything, except maybe making some minor changes, because then we can go to the other one that we haven't even touched upon.
So a lot of the comment that I had, and I kind of communicated to the mayor, was really about the size restriction. Now, Scott, I noticed what you sent out here today, in fact, doesn't even mention it
Right,
in terms of size restriction.
right.
So I think it focused, as I thought, on screen, that's critical.
Mhm.
Now, some of the examples you guys sent us, and thank you for doing that, because
Right,
they're pretty telling.
right.
And it almost feels to me like what they're doing, in fact, would be a violation of any code, in some cases.
Sure.
But I think what you're recommending now, which at least for general commercial, does not have a size limit. It seems like, and my only question was so anyway, I think, Mayor, it probably would be appropriate let Scott present. I think the slides are real good.
Yeah, but I just don't wanna take a lot of time. I mean, let's just cover the key aspects, so that we don't lose out on the next conversation, which I think is gonna take longer than this one.
Yeah, I have one it's an important question to me. Is, you mentioned the site plan, that this would happen at the site plan, right?
Mhm.
So I think I am leaning towards agreement, who cares about the size if it's part of the site plan and properly screened and all of that. Now, if someone moves in after the fact, is that, I guess they would have to eat up a bunch of parking and still properly screen it and all that.
They'd have to operate in compliance with the site plan that was approved, or they'd have to amend their site plan for their new use. So yeah, I was just gonna give a real brief history
Okay.
before
Go for it.
turning it over to Devin to discuss the proposed language. So, obviously, the town board and planning commission over the past 30 years, we've adopted corridor plans and other design standards to protect the general commercial zone as well as the gateways to the community, and that's led to somewhat the small town charm that we enjoy today. So that's why when staff is looking at this language, we're trying not to just throw out what we've been doing for the last 30 years, because it's worked fairly well. And the other thing I wanted to point out was, this language is intended to apply to new site plans and not to retroactively make existing non-conforming site plans a use by right. And I think that's something that we've had references to several of the sites around town that might not be in compliance with their site plan, and we purposely did not want to try and make those sites compliant with this language, because some of them are fairly, I guess, this isn't something that was approved with the original site plan, it was part of a reuse project. We all wish Iron Mountain had been a successful autoplex, however, the down economy and the fall of Detroit and all of that lent to reuse of these properties. So the town had to partner with the property owner to get new uses in there during the down economy, and unfortunately, some of those uses lean more towards a limited industrial zone as opposed to a general commercial. And so, again, this outdoor storage wasn't part of the original site plan, it's kind of organically
No,
grew.
what would happen, we can't make them correct that, or?
We can, I'll fess up, we've, over the years, tried not to be big brother to our business community, and we've tried to be,
Flexible.
we try to be flexible and not be anti-business. So we have worked with the business on various occasions when the outdoor storage of tires became an issue for a while, those kind of things. So, some of these reuse projects, the reason we're not trying to address those with this language is because these are kind of a unique situation. They're reuse that happened during the downturn, and there is probably some follow-up that staff needs to do with some of these.
Scott, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Can you go back one slide?
Mhm.
So when this autoplex was put in, that version of a screened-in fence wasn't there.
Right,
When this was a regular Chevy dealership,
right,
on that corner, there was no fence like that.
right.
So at what point did they come back and add the fence? Did somebody make them aware of they're in a general commercial, what they're doing no longer, meets that?
Right.
This bill, and so somebody tried to make them do it retro to a general commercial purpose or limited industrial, or what? How did we end up with a fence that's non-conforming?
Without going into too much detail about each individual
Sure.
business, we have had conversations with the property owner and the business owner over the years. They may have taken it upon themselves to put up a fence that wasn't something that was part of an amended
Okay.
site plan, that kind of thing. So,
Would that, excuse me, would that fence be considered adequate screening today, under this new code?
generally, we don't allow chain link with slats to
Good.
be the permanent
Good.
screening solution.
So going forward with our new ordinance, potentially,
Mhm.
how would we address something like this? A change of use coming, if they came to us with a change of use?
I would have to follow up with the business owner, staff would, give them the administrative site plan process to propose whatever storage they're wanting to install, and during that amended site plan, we would look at their screening
Okay.
methods and that type of thing, the location.
Okay.
So yeah, these, again, I just wanted to throw it out there that although we've talked about these uses, they are somewhat unique.
But the other thing I think we have to recognize, because I think it will continue to come up, a lot of these folks, when they came on board, they probably, even in their initial site plan, may not have drawn that out. Because some of this stuff is as the business comes into being
Evolves.
and evolves or grows, or they decide, oh, this might be a good idea.
Succeeds.
Then they, because that's how we kind of have some of these things that happened, and it wouldn't have been shown probably even in the initial site plan, and that may continue to happen. Because, folks, because that's kind of what happened here, and then they just kind of did their own thing, and at some point in time, the town then was alerted or saw, and there it was, right?
So yeah, the uses out at Southgate are somewhat unique, and they're similar to more of a limited industrial use, which could be something that if the owners out there wanted to look at a rezoning to a more limited industrial zone, that is something that is an option. And then we do have some of these others that we talked about that are adjacent to residential on the other side of the street or the other side of the alley. So I simply wanted to throw those in there so that that's why staff hasn't been addressing the existing non-conforming sites. We didn't think that you would want to amend the code to make these types of things uses by right. This one was approved with a conditional use grant, and that one is probably just something that needs to be cleaned up on the backside of the building, So at the last meeting, you also asked about where are these located. The general commercial zone is essentially at I-25, Highway 34, Main Street, the downtown, or the core Main Street areas up on Harmony Road. And then it's important to also notice that general commercial zoning or uses are also allowed in up to 25% of residential mixed-use zones. So whatever we do in the general commercial zone does potentially could end up in some residential areas if they were designed for a small neighborhood commercial center or something like that. So just wanted to show these maps because I know at the last meeting the board had questions about where those uses could possibly locate. So with that, as Mr. Sislowski pointed out, the old thresholds based on square footages are gone, the percentages are gone. We took the direction from the last work session, and we thought we heard that the screening of outdoor storage and maybe the location of it is more important than the actual thresholds and square footages. So with that, Devin, I can show you the 3 new accessory uses that we drew up for the general commercial zone.
So last time it seemed like maybe we should be a little more clear with the definitions, so that's what we did. Accessory outdoor storage shall be used for storage of materials or equipment used in the course of business, including inventory for storage or sale, overstock, or bulk items versus display is incidental to the primary retail use, and merchandise on display shall be related to merchandise for sale within the principal building. So we tried to make that a little more clear. This is basically just where accessory outdoor storage, how it can be, locations must be depicted on a approved site plan, like Scott has already talked about. Must not use areas designated for parking, must be completely screened from streets, drives, and residential uses. Screening must match the building design, and, the last one is site constraints preclude complete screening, CUG approval of a screening plan by planning commission or town board required. And then for the display, locations must be depicted on approved site plan, must not utilize areas designated for parking, must be within 50 or 40 feet of customer entrances, must maintain 4 feet clear path for pedestrian use. So that's like what you can see outside Home Depot, etc. And then lastly, seasonal sales, locations must be depicted on approved site plan, limited to not more than 5% of areas designated for parking, and limited to 60 calendar days per calendar year. Any questions about
Yeah.
those requirements?
What does screening must match building design mean? Can you give
So,
me an
so for example, if you have King Soopers, you know, they have some of that masonry work, and they have, you know, they have some brick, they have some masonry stone.
Yeah.
So it would need to incorporate that architecture into the screening, you know, whether that's just one pillar within some, you know, more basic screen fencing or something like that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm for striking a balance. I think we wanna look good but still be accommodating. If we can talk specifics of Ace Hardware, how would this, you know, sometimes, I know they have stuff in front and I think they
Yes.
maintain the sidewalk. What about, I think during the spring they put out fertilizer in the parking, that's seasonal?
So we would call that seasonal sales, so we also went through and changed the definition of seasonal sales, cause currently it specifically calls out seasonal sales as Christmas tree, pumpkin sales. So we kinda changed up the definition to allow, you know, if we're moving into the summer season, you could bring out something like lawn or plants, etc., because that would fall into a seasonal category instead of just pumpkins and Christmas trees.
Okay,
So, yeah,
not as specific.
not as specific, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
But it does sound like from what you said, that the screening almost has to be hard. It can't be fenced.
No, it could, so, I mean, it would need to have some masonry incorporated into it, but the whole thing doesn't have to be one giant 30-foot wall.
Right.
Yeah.
And one thing on this chart I noticed that jumped out was the, Frederick, I think, has a setback requirement from residential. And I'm assuming that'll just be addressed on your site plan, or will we?
We didn't go that far in our draft bullet points, so we didn't include a setback from residential. If that's something that the board wanted to incorporate, we could do that, but we didn't go quite that far with the language we proposed.
It seems to me when you see a site plan, you're gonna have some criteria against which you're gonna look at it and say, okay, this is good, or, oh, wait, no, make it smaller.
Right.
So it'll be ad hoc, I'm thinking, as to what it may look like on a particular site plan.
Right, and if it falls within a corridor plan or an area that has development standards within the annexation agreement, we would also adhere to those as well.
So under this current plan here, what Mr. Lin proposed up there, it would qualify because it would now be cut, because it's considered storage in the course of business, including inventory for storage, correct? As long as
The
it would be
pending
screened.
conditional use grant application.
Well, I mean, if we were to set this
Mhm.
in place for,
If it
the
would-
general commercial area,
If the.
it
if
would
it
follow
meets
that
the
now,
complete-
correct?
If it meets the completely screened criteria, it would. However, if it's not completely screened, I don't know, we may wanna go back to that slide. If it can't be completely screened, whether it's for some site constraint, topography, or something like that, then it would go through a planning, or a conditional use grant review by planning commission and town board.
But it only has to be completely screened from these, so I mean, as long as it's completely screened from the one street, if he's got nothing else around him but open space,
Our intent was that it needs to be completely screened with the language, so if it's visible from other streets or other properties, then it would need to go through the conditional use grant. That's the way it's written now, anyway.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think really what we might be boiling down to is how well to make the screening specs. How tall, how opaque or not opaque, you know, as we've looked at that other example. And I'm by no means I'm just trying to infer what I'm coming at, which is maybe if it's in general commercial and if there's gonna be outdoor storage, it needs to be screened and these are the minimums.
That's
And
why I
maybe
was
we don't
asking
have
about-
that, and so that's where we need to,
I think
That's why I was asking about bullet point 4 about screening must match building design. I don't know what that means. If I
yeah,
follow-
I think
as
we're
a
making
woman-
this all still way too much more complicated.
Yeah.
Because really, and then what are we gonna say, you can only have this kind of, we only have these three kinds of screening mechanisms, or if it doesn't match, who's gonna go out and be the person to say, this I can see through this, and somebody said, well, I can't see. I mean, you either need to say it's screened and have that, and whatever that means. I don't know that we wanna get into details of then we're going back to what we had before, where we were talking about square footage and all of that kind of thing.
I think this could be a question though. Completely screened, and that's 100%, that makes sense to me. The type of screening, I would have questions if I were a business owner. So I need some help on that.
Well,
well,
don't we,
like for instance, Iron Mountain could say that they are completely
They're
screened.
completely screened, and does it match the?
well, we're not gonna go back and retroactively do anything with those.
I
businesses.
understand it, but I'm just saying, if we don't
Next
like
one,
that
the next
screening
one, right.
mechanism, then that's where we need to
Right.
talk about,
Right.
that's not sufficient of,
So I
as
just,
to what
you know,
this
I
board would
agree
want.
with what you're saying. I think just a little definition somewhere about what you mean by screening must match building design.
Or what's not allowed for screening, such as
Yeah.
chain link with,
Just, I would, if I
Well,
was a
don't we have that
business owner, I
somewhere,
would need
cause you
some
just said it's not
guidelines.
allowed, so it's gotta be somewhere
Yeah.
already in
It's
the,
already in the code.
it's already in the code.
Okay,
that's right.
What we have and what we can't, what we allow and what we don't allow.
But it's not in the code under this section.
I'm sorry.
It's not in the code under this particular section, under the general commercial. You know, at least what
Right,
you
it's in-
proposed is
It's
right.
in the limited industrial zone, because currently the interpretation is outdoor storage isn't allowed in the general commercial zone.
So we
Right,
need to add it,
yeah.
and be consistent. If we're allowing it, we need to add the,
Yeah, I mean, can't we
Wait,
just take,
something.
if this one covers, can't we just add general commercial to this?
This is their proposed general commercial language, Mayor.
Oh, I thought you were.
No, because the light industrial does have a little bit longer limit requirements.
Right, and that's
Here we go.
because we anticipate outdoor storage to be in the industrial zones.
Yeah, because the approach here, and I guess I could almost get comfortable, is it really is leaving the planning department with the authority to kind of loosely apply this and say, this is acceptable, no, this isn't, on an ad hoc basis.
Yeah.
Now, that may result in a lot of
Inconsistent.
inconsistency across the
interpretation,
town.
interpretation.
Which is what brought up this specific case that
Yeah.
started this, was the town was saying that was limited industrial, they're saying, no, it's general commercial. And it was all because of trying to interpret what their use was going to be, what our code said, and then
Yeah.
requiring the CUG, so.
So we want to be more specific in terms of what is adequate screening, or what is not permitted?
So let's kind of, because I feel like we're not sticking to the mayor's 30-minute quick time.
No,
frame.
and, yeah, we need to like.
So I want to ask you, as far as things the elements that the board likes versus elements you don't like, so do you like generally the idea of it being screened? It would only be conditional use if they can't meet that 100%, so that means that most of the time we want to treat it like the site plan, the new site plan, which is it's gonna be administrative. And if they can't meet that 100% screen, then that triggers, and that's one meeting with planning and zoning and one with the board. So they do have that public process if they can't get there. So if you guys like those ideas generally and generally what you're hearing here, I think we just need to describe more and make sure you understand when we bring the ordinance, what matching the existing building means, and we can bring down language as far as what screening will be. Would we be okay from that point, bringing in orders that look like that to the board?
Because you're gonna have to look at too, there's gonna be some things that are not gonna be able to be 100% screened. They are from a certain distance, but as you, I mean, it depends, that could be subject to,
Yeah.
depending how far out you go, because if I'm, 100 feet, I can't, or maybe, or even 500 feet, but if I get up, further back, I'm gonna be able to see something behind there. We can't have these people building these fortresses just to hide it, make sure that nobody sees. So I don't even know that I like the term 100%, because that could be subject to interpretation.
Well,
But
I
then
think
they
by
can do the
100% we
CUG
mean
process.
on all the roadways, Your Honor. That's not necessarily meaning, from, if you're on Steeplechase Drive, can you see
Right,
it?
but then that maybe needs to be in here somehow, so
But it
people,
says from streets, drives, and residential uses,
so,
so it gives a little flexibility.
Well, and if the terrain, I think it covers it in the CUG.
Yeah.
If the terrain is such that you're above
Yeah.
from the street, well, then go through the conditions grant and we'll talk about it.
Mhm.
And we have the planning
Okay.
commission give an opinion on this.
So,
so do you have enough to
I think we
develop
do.
something that could actually come before us, so we don't have to, we're not coming back to another work
please
session?
no.
Come on.
Yeah.
Please.
If the board generally
How about a
is
weekend?
okay
This is it.
with what we've talked about, and the bones of this seem right to you, and we just need to define a little bit better our screening, staff can certainly prepare that. Okay?
Okay,
All right, thank you.
okay.
Thank you, John.
Let's move on to the next one then, which is our code update on multifamily residential parking.
Oh, it's up on the windows.
Shane does, he's always willing to offer a charger for the mayor, for her iPad.
Oh, you bet. Is your phone?
I thought, well, no, my iPad is gonna be,
Okay, yeah.
I thought I had just charged it.
Oh,
Good evening, everyone. So, trying to be respectful of your time and move kind of quickly through my side of saying things to leave time for questions, but feel free to jump in if I'm not explaining something or giving detail. So we had a work session earlier in June, talked about possibly the need for the code amendment on multifamily parking. The idea behind this is we believe the current code of 1.5 parking spaces may be on the low side. And we want to avoid situations where there's parking in fire lanes and bike lanes on landscaped areas, things like that, where we're gonna get code enforcement complaints, potential life safety problems. So last work session, the takeaway we got was most of town board felt like this was a concern, and also to base the parking ratio on number of bedrooms versus number of units. So what we've come up with is we've compared it to neighboring jurisdictions and also looked at the international, or the Institute of Transportation Engineers, what they recommend for parking. And it's important to understand there's no uniformly accepted parking ratio. It's gonna be different for every community, every site within a community, just due to the makeup of the residents. Is there transit nearby? Are they families, are they couples, are they roommates with multiple cars? So it's an educated guess of what kind of parking ratio you need. We wanted to try and strike a balance between a moderate increase, just to make sure we're covered, but not placing too much burden on developers. The biggest concern, the primary concern, is when there's no on-street parking in the proximity to the development. When there is on-street parking, it does allow for some overflow, which we think has generally worked in existing developments. There are a couple of recent examples have been built on arterial roadways that don't allow for on-street parking. And that's kind of what brought all this to our attention to begin with. So there is a credit given when you have on-street parking adjacent to your site, which is intended to essentially offset this increase. Let's see. So what's proposed, we do believe is in line with the neighboring jurisdictions for the most part. And so that credit I mentioned, it's for every 25 feet of linear frontage, you can receive a credit for that, up to 10% of their total required parking. And this is similar to what we do in the downtown area currently for all uses. So that's all I have on this, so any questions, I'll be happy to try and address.
Any questions or comments?
I guess,
Mr. Morbeck?
sorry. Yes, yeah, so I kept looking at this, and in particular, I was trying to focus on the number of cars per household. And Governing Magazine did a survey, and they had published numbers for major cities, but it includes Fort Collins and Greeley, it doesn't include Windsor.
What?
I know. I was kind of surprised. Fort Collins has an average of 1.86 cars per household. Greeley's 1.96. I'm blaming that on CSU. Probably a lot of students, some don't own cars and yet they're residents. So if you look 1.96 or 2, the only question I had on this chart, because I think otherwise it works, is on the 4-bedroom. Then you must be assuming there's either more than one family living in it or a bunch of roommates. If you go to 3, since average household is 1.96. So I'm wondering if we're really building more than we need to in terms of parking.
Based on the 4-bedroom, or all of them?
Well, the 4-bedroom's the only one that requires 3 spaces.
Right,
And
so that's your concern, not the,
I'm wondering if it's really requiring too much, because the average household, at least in Greeley, is 1.92 cars
2 cars, yeah.
per family. So in a 4-bedroom, then you must think there's more than one family,
Or roommates.
or a bunch of roommates.
I feel like me and
But if there's
teenagers,
both,
cars,
yeah.
my wife has a car, I have a car.
I'm sorry?
Teenagers.
Having teenagers.
2 adults and a teenager, each person's working. It's
Yeah.
possible.
Which is true,
It's
all
possible.
over Greeley. And you end up with a 1.96.
And multifamily?
Something to keep in mind is the percentage of 4-bedroom apartments out there is gonna be probably very
Very small,
low.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, most of them
Multifamily,
are.
not a house with 4
Not
bedrooms.
I can't picture that in multifamily.
So if it is a little bit high, it's not gonna have much effect overall.
Yeah.
I think you did.
Their rent for a 4-bedroom,
So in fact, you
$3
looked,
grand a
You can
month.
buy 2
Pelican.
houses. 2 houses and a tent.
you had looked at Pelican Bluffs and Fossil Ridge, and neither of them had 4-bedroom apartments.
Correct.
So they,
We don't have any, do we? Even those new ones that are coming up there, they're not, there's not 4, they're only 3-bedroom, aren't they?
I'm
Isn't
not
that?
aware of any right now.
Yes, do we even need that?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's a pretty low scenario for an apartment to have 4 bedrooms, but I don't know that it hurts the town necessarily to have that requirement. I mean, if that's a deal breaker,
Yeah,
just 'cause-
probably not gonna come up. I really like the credit for on-street parking.
Mm-hmm.
I think it gives us some flexibility.
I even wondered why you would cap that though, right?
Yeah.
If you happen to have a place with a lot of on-street parking that can be used, do the linear, you know.
How does
Before
it
you-
address?
You can't create a hassle for the other neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
For the rest of the neighborhood, so no.
I agree.
It's a good starting point, and if someone wanted to contest it, they could.
What if you get another apartment building across the street, and the on-street parking has already been allocated to the other building, correct?
That's a great question. I wouldn't say it's already been allocated. I think the way it's written, each could
Claim
claim
it.
the credit.
You get credit on your own linear frontage. So it's just on, if you border
Your side of the road.
Chestnut, you get credit for Chestnut on your side of the street. If another apartment was built on the other side of Chestnut, they would get credit for their side of the street. So we don't give credit for all the frontage, we just get it for what's adjoining the property.
Okay.
Yeah. To me, this is a little bit like the storage we've gone over a few times. We could break it down and this a little bit this way, this a little bit that way. Overall, I think we all have acknowledged that there is a need for additional parking, and I think this addresses it.
And I looked at the number of bedrooms. I looked at it that way to think, does every bedroom have a car? So on Fossil Ridge would have been 670 bedrooms, and they were gonna put in 611 spots. I don't know what that means. It just didn't seem like enough based on bedrooms if everyone drives. A 2-bedroom is most likely a married couple or roommates. 1 bedroom is guaranteed to have a car, I assume.
Yeah.
Or two if it's a couple.
I
Two
guess
if it's
we're
a couple.
assuming though that everybody's gonna continue to make purchases and, I mean, because I've been told that even folks that are proposing shopping centers and shopping malls these days are being asked to put in less parking, not more. And they're doing that intentionally, because if they crowd parking and folks can't, I mean, they hope folks will find alternative transit methods, Uber, you know, and some other things to get there, instead of everybody coming by their own vehicle. So they're intentionally kinda, you know, and I'm talking to folks now who, a lot, you know, like in Denver, they are one-car families. Even though there's two, I mean, I have somebody all the time, she'll say, well, he's got the car, so you gotta plan these dates and these dates, otherwise I gotta get there some other way. So there is some transition happening.
Absolutely, there is.
Anything, any other questions or comments, or is everybody satisfied with the way this reads now, so we can move forward?
And right now, we were 1.5.
Right now, it's 1.5 across the board. Just
Across the board.
It's just based on unit, not number of bedrooms.
So we're not changing that one at all. That would mean for the one bedroom,
Right.
it's staying the same.
I guess the same thing, I still question whether the 4-bedroom needs to be 3, although the practical impact of that may be none. Also, the 10% on that, I'd be curious if you could, can you guesstimate the math on Pelican Bluffs or Fossil Ridge and say if you were to get credit for the off-street parking, what it would have come out to?
I did do that on the one on Steeplechase, and it came out to about 10%.
About exactly
Yeah.
that? Okay.
I would suspect in the future, if we had a developer coming in, all decided to build a lot of 4 bedrooms, but this, you know, the times had changed, they could come through some kind of special use to make, to try to get this changed, or
Ask for
based
better-
on current stats or something, Scott?
Well, as trends go towards autonomous vehicles or more alternative means of transit, we'll definitely want to review this code again and update it so that it's contemporary at that time. I think we're just at the very early stages of those types of technology, and right now, you know, when you're talking about a multifamily complex that may not have immediate services right around it for the time being, that's something to consider in the future as well.
Right, well, and it's kind of, the mayor's question was whether or not if a developer came in 3 years and said, I've got 100 units and they're all 4-bedroom because that's what the market trends tell us we need now, what process would they have for a variance or some kind of exemption from the board if it turns out all of a sudden it was, you know?
Well, or if they had some proof or data that they only needed 2
Yeah.
spaces because of who and what they're selling to. Would they have some option, could they go through, what would be the process?
The current code allows for planning commission, maybe it's planning commission, to make a parking determination when there's a question as to what the right ratio is.
But that's more if the use isn't enumerated in the parking code. So where this is enumerated, we'd probably have to allow some additional language for that as an option. If because transit's available or other,
Well, we have senior housing coming and maybe they need less parking, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there should be some language that somebody who has a good, a good situation that they can
yeah.
justify why they might need less. There should be something that allows them to go either to planning or something to seek.
I think Paul can probably extrapolate from that existing language that he just mentioned, and we could make a minor modification to that for when the ordinance comes back to you.
Okay.
I'm also thinking about Dennis's engineering standards. He's got some language where if somebody can't strictly comply with a street standard or a sewer standard, if they present engineering backup to an alternative, that the code interpreter can consider that, rather than having it come back to an elected body or an appointed body. You keep it with the technocrats, so to speak, and just make certain that you define, well, what kind of data would we need to justify a variance? And I think with the experience I've had with Dennis in that, as long as it's backed by a parking engineer or, you know, somebody like Fox Tuttle, then that's worth considering, but if it's just, you know, made up stuff, then maybe not.
But I think to kind of split that hair, I think with engineering specifically, it's engineer to engineer, they're gonna say, well, what about this, what about that, and I think they can get there. I think when it's parking requirements, it's gonna still go to staff's gonna say, okay, this was an engineering firm that did this, and it looks legitimate, but, to give an exemption to a code, I'd still rather that goes through planning and zoning and the board versus staff, you know, if we say 3 and we're okay with 2.5, I'd rather that still went through our elected bodies. You know, I think the staff's gonna still read through that and say, this looks legitimate, here you go, but, you know what I'm saying? Cause I think when it's Dennis and they're talking about drainage pans and the thickness of that doesn't need to go to elected bodies, it's just, well, if
My
it's under,
favorite topic.
if it's under 2 inches thick of drainage pan, that comes to you, anything over that.
1.78 inches thick or 1.77 inches thick?
Yeah, as long as there's some flexibility
recourse.
somewhere where somebody
Right.
has the option to at least ask, it doesn't mean they're gonna get an exemption, but has the option to
Right.
at least position it somewhere with somebody.
Right, okay, yeah, well, I think that, Mr. Hornbeck can handle that with the language, so, golly, why are you guys?
Just be a Board of Adjustment issue though, anyway?
Uh,
Is it just a zoning hearing?
no, I think it'd be more just going through your normal planning and zoning meeting, and when they
Okay.
calculate the parkings, you just kind of work it through there.
If we're 5 years from now and we get 2 or 3 or more exception requests, that's when we have to sit down and say, do we need to change the code?
Yeah.
Well, or I think, as Scott said, they're planning, I mean, how often do you guys look at these I mean, what, is there something like a
5-year
ticker, like
plan.
that says every 3 years we need to look at this, or is it just as you get, as Barry pointed out, after you get a lot of them happening, or is there something systematic that?
It's usually if we see a trend in variance requests or something like that, we would take that specific section of the code up. Right now, obviously, when we're doing a fairly comprehensive code update, you'll be seeing different sections of the code periodically over the coming months, but, so hopefully we'll catch a lot of those with this overall code update.
Okay. Is everybody good with that?
I'm good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So,
Fly down Dennis real quick.
okay. While he's doing that, we might as well make introductions, because we've got guests from CDOT here.
Sorry to creep into the middle of that.
So I think first of all, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves one by one. And, oh good, bring the rest of them in. We're gonna make introductions.
I'll wait.
Dennis can sit in the hallway, he doesn't.
Okay, everybody grab a seat so we can make introductions.
Hi, Mayor.
Hi,
Oh,
how
yeah.
are you?
Fine, how are you doing today?
Good.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay. Okay, so why don't we start here, the board will make our introductions and then we'll let CDOT introduce who they have here.
I'm Miles Baker, I represent District 1 on the town board,
Larimer County side
Larimer County.
is where he lives, just so you I mean.
Sure,
not
no,
that
no,
it matters,
up on the-
but you know,
Yeah, I'm Barry Wilson, District 2, I'm also on the Larimer County side, we're actually the only 2 on the Larimer County side.
Okay.
Ken Bennett, District 3, and I drive 34 a lot, so.
Hey, perfect, that's good. Shane Hill, Town Manager. Hello.
Paul Rennemeyer, District 4, and I try to avoid 34.
Can't blame you, it's gonna get better.
David Soslowski, District 6, which is really Water Valley, and yeah, I go down O Street and across the back end.
Christy Melendez, Mayor of Windsor, and then we have,
Kim Emeling, Assistant Town Attorney.
Dennis Wagner, Director of Engineering for the town.
Ian McCarter, Town Attorney.
Luke Keen, I'm with CDOT, I'm here to cheer these guys on.
okay,
This is my boss, Luke Keen. I'm Chad Hall, I'm the project manager for the US 34 PEL.
I'm Zeke Lynch, I'm a traffic engineer with Jacobs Engineering, helping Chad out. I'm David Wolfall with TSH Engineering out of Denver, we're on the Jacobs team doing the engineering side.
I'm sorry, can you two gentlemen, what was your name?
Zeke Lynch,
Who's Chad? And
David Wolfall.
David, I couldn't get that.
okay, we're ready.
First
first I want to say thanks a lot, guys, for letting us come in and talk to you. We've been doing these kind of localized meetings with a lot of the communities, trying to reach out and give them a handle on what we've been up to the last couple of years. We've been doing this planning and environmental linkages study, which is a big study that you perform on a corridor wide segment so that you can be prepared should funding become available. So where funding is available and projects are moving forward, that's not necessarily of interest to a PEL. It's more so when you're hoping some funding becomes available and you want to be well positioned to spend that money. So we, in addition to these kind of smaller one-on-one meetings, we've been getting together with NFR MPO occasionally, and we presented beginning of this month to NFR MPO. I think maybe you might have been absent.
I was, yeah, I was.
Yep, right.
Kids.
Yep. Yeah, so this, basically what we have for you guys today is more or less that presentation, boiled down just a little bit. We wanted, you guys have an opportunity to ask questions, and kind of get a general idea of what we've been up to. So, with that, we'll do, mouse is right here, thank you. Yeah, like I said, overview, partners and, the purpose and need. I'll talk about schedule and then I'll hand it off to Zeke and he'll walk through some of the recommendations that he and Dave and the rest of the team came up with, and then we'll talk about ongoing activities and next steps from here. So long corridor, foothills clear out to Kersey. You guys have a small piece right there on County Road 17, and that's the major amount of land that you guys have right now. Of course, there's some of that's not zoned in that area, so who's to say who's going to expand that direction, but that's where you guys are at right now. Yeah, a lot of really good partners. We've had technical advisory committee TAC meetings monthly. Dennis has been able to make it to a handful of those, so that's been helpful. Get the perspective of all the locals is very important because we don't understand the corridor as well as the locals do. So that helps provide some insight for us. Let's see. So I'm not going to read all these. This is just a general overview of the PEL. It's out of the CDOT PEL handbook. Primarily, I just wanted to show that we are right there. So we're getting right toward the end. Zeke and the team are putting together the final report. They'll get that to us, and CDOT will have a couple-week review process, and then we'll kick it off to the TAC. Actually, after the consultants have incorporated CDOT comments, and then the TAC members will all have an opportunity to walk through and review and see what we've come up with and provide any responses. And I shouldn't say see what we've come up with, because we've done a fair amount of outreach here, so none of the things that come up will be a surprise for anybody. It's just what it ended up looking like in the report. Let's see. So purpose and need. At the very beginning of this project, we put together a purpose and need, and you guys are no doubt familiar with this. You gotta have an idea of what you're doing and how you're going to do it and why you're doing it. So at the very beginning of this process, we put together a purpose and need statement with the 34 Coalition, which is all those stakeholders or representative from each of the stakeholders, and then also with the help of the TAC to get a general idea of what we were trying to accomplish in this corridor, what was most important to everybody. And then that was kind of the driving factor that we then incorporated into our alternatives analysis and sort of used that as the steering for the whole shebang. So I'm going to read it because it costs a lot of money. The purpose of highway improvements is to preserve US 34 as a vital east-west regional transportation corridor. Improvements will link and move goods, people, and information reliably and be phased to adapt to future travel demands and funding opportunities. So as we were going through, these are the needs that were then the primary, three of the primary focuses, I guess, for looking at the alternatives. So safety, obviously, number one, always number one. Accommodate increased travel and tourism demand, and maintain the economic vitality of the region. It's growing around here. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that or not. There's been some population growth and whatnot, so trying to make sure our transportation system is keeping up is very important. And then increased reliability, and that goes hand in hand. Increased reliability of east-west regional travel, and this becomes a little bit of a balance because you have mobility and you have access, right? Mobility is getting as quickly as you can from one point to another, and access is you still got to be able to pull off the road when you need to pull off the road, right? So, best case scenario, you have a long, high-speed roadway with interchanges everywhere, but that's not feasible, especially in some of the corridors and what they end up looking So, some of the ways that we judge whether or not an alternative was a good one was if it's compatible with the natural human environment, if it supports community land use and aesthetic goals, if it's fiscally responsible and implementable, and then reduce risk and increase resiliency. You might also say reliability in that, and then accommodate emerging technology. I was talking a minute ago about the autonomous vehicles, things like that. That's not something we got into in a whole lot of depth, but it's certainly something that's on the forefront of everybody's minds as we're developing these projects, so. Yes, sir.
When you talk about increased reliability, does that have anything to do with estimated time? for
Yeah,
travel?
absolutely,
That's what I thought.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's right. So if it takes you 15 minutes to get from A to B,
A to B,
it
that's.
needs to always take 15 minutes to get to A to
So
B.
90% of the time you can do it in 15 minutes.
Sure,
or whatever.
yeah.
That's not- Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, not necessarily getting down into the numbers and that, to that degree, but absolutely, yeah, that's the principle behind the thing. So again, the schedule, we're right toward the end. Yeah, it says up here, August 31st, draft PEL for CDOT review, that's actually middle of September. Is that what we said, September 14, I think?
Yeah, I think that should be our delivery date to you is what we're targeting, but yeah, the 2 weeks later is.
That is when we get it back to you guys, that's right,
Yeah.
sorry. So yeah, so that's where we're at right now. Yeah, and we'll get it out for a look from all the TAC, and then, of course, all of you folks are more than welcome to review and provide comments on that. We didn't know that there'd be a whole lot of interest in the PEL as a whole amongst the electeds, but that's an option, certainly. So that said, I'll hand it off to Zeke and walk the alternative stuff.
So I'm gonna stand up just so I can see the screen too, and I don't get a drink in my neck, so forgive me for that. But we wanna spend as much or as little time as this group wants us to as far as the details here. So please stop us at any time if you have questions or if you want us to provide more information. We're certainly willing to do that. So through our alternative development evaluation process, we kind of had 3 tiers. And so the first tier was really, do projects kind of meet the overall purpose and need that Chad was describing? The tier 2 was a little bit more detailed, but we really started to focus on core concepts. We considered roadway and access concepts to be core. We considered supplemental elements as part of that, so it's things like transit, bicycle, and pedestrian, alternate modes, those type of things. And then in level 3 is where we really started to, kind of shake the funnel a little bit and see what alternatives really meshed together and what made sense. So that was kind of our tiered process for alternative screening. Here's the individual segments. So the recommendations, I'll just hit real quick. The ones that you guys are probably most interested in are Johnstown, Greeley, and Greeley Expressway. So in these 2 segments here, our recommendation is to have a 6-lane cross-section and interchanges at major cross streets. So right now it's 4 lanes with signalized intersections. So that's how the corridor may change if these recommendations are implemented.
So, sir, excuse me, but when you say interchange, you're talking about a cloverleaf?
Bridge.
It could be, so that's the benefit of the PEL process, is that we just need to narrow the funnel for a future NEPA team that will take the torch and actually go into the details. We're just trying to say, is an interchange required, but not what type it might be. So it could be a cloverleaf, it could be a diamond, it could be a diverging diamond. There's lots of different configurations that could be, but we're just saying an interchange is needed at those locations.
Well, a diamond like 392 and I-95 was kind of our base condition. It's kind of a simple, reasonable, conservative interchange.
Oh, I-25.
Sorry?
Are we in Michigan?
Yeah, where were you there?
I-95.
You said
It's okay, you said I-95, it's okay.
This is the Windsor, County.
Oh, thank you anyway, folks.
Windsor, Colorado.
So these high-powered engineers work all over the nation.
There's diamonds everywhere. A reasonably conservative, functions well at a lot of traffic levels. That's kind of our base condition. There are some odd locations here where you have railroads and stuff where other things might apply, but.
Or for example, a cemetery in Greeley,
Right.
35th Avenue, right? Can't build a ramp on a cemetery.
So
at that point,
we
you
had to
start
get a lot
getting
more
into some
creative in that
Yeah.
area than we would have elsewhere.
Right. And the primary purpose, like Zeke is saying, is
Tunnel
to,
doesn't work either.
is to prep the future team, the actual design team, to be able to do, tunnel 7 feet. To do some,
Just keep going.
Just keep plugging on, okay.
We have done
This
this
is an actual
presentation
question,
so
Nancy.
many times, Mayor, that we're accustomed to this because this is how most of our executive meetings go. So we're
Because we
good
do have a
with
hard
this. We're
stop
okay
at
with
6:55. 5, so we've gotta get
We shouldn't
upstairs,
be
so.
pushing that. The main idea on this, in addition to setting us up for the future project team to be able to take it further, is that the locals know that, hey, we're thinking interchange here eventually. And what that means is, if you've got a developer coming in saying, hey, I like that corner, I'm gonna build right there, then you guys can say, you know, what we're thinking is ultimately we're gonna have an interchange there, so probably that's not a great idea to be around that corner. So that kind of helps plan, and then obviously the corridor with the interchange versus an intersection, especially if you're forced into an intersection, because you don't have the right-of-way available, or you get into condemnation, all these other things that you can avoid when we get ahead of the game, right, by doing a study like this, so, sorry, Zeke.
No, that's perfect context for where we're going here, so I don't think, unless you want me to, I can go into the details. The one in particular that you probably care most about is Will County Road 17. So we do recommend an interchange at that location. In addition to the interchanges, you know, east and west of there. Right now, it's kind of configuration to be determined based on future traffic volumes and future need, but we do know that we are recommending an interchange there. So over into the Greeley Expressway segment, this is where we had a couple of different options at various locations. So this is back to what I was saying earlier, that we didn't specifically say an interchange is required here. For example, 65th and 71st is the place where Greeley is kind of trying to make up their mind about where they want that interchange to be. It's one or the other, but not both. So we've made a recommendation to allow that flexibility for a future NEPA team to pick that up based on, you know, conditions at that time to reevaluate that and see where it goes.
Can you go back one to the other Windsor?
This one?
At 13, number 3?
Yeah, sure.
What are you looking at there?
So a couple of different alignments of Weld County Road 13, and so Johnstown was particularly interested in, you know, at least initially just paving the southern segment of that road. But one is kind of a tighter diamond right around the existing location, and another is to realign Weld County Road 13 in order to fix some of the grades. So Dave, chime in here on what needs to happen on that bottom option.
It was an idea to utilize, because you need bridges over the railroad, to utilize that same bridge to get the road under it as well. It ends up with, you know, a pretty unconventional interchange layout, but it's a way of utilizing the bridges, getting double use out of them, I guess.
So the problem is, we can't do anything with the railroad, because you guys know, you can't ever touch railroads. And so we have to go over the top, and we can't go over the top at the existing alignment of the road and then get back down, right? Because there's not enough room to get back down without having 45 degree angle. So you have to just, it's a big project.
Yeah. Do you guys take into account like some of our future growth, like on 13, you know, we're adding rain dance, which could be like 8,000 residents at Crossroads and County Road 13.
So all of the projected needs for improvements on the transportation system are reflected in the North Front Range model. So whatever land use forecast they have are the forecast that we're utilizing to forecast our traffic for 2040. So all these needs are based on that 2040 projection.
Okay.
Now, if something changes, if a big development comes in that's not reflected in that, then, you know, a future team will have to reevaluate and say what needs to change.
Thanks.
But for now, it's 2040 based on the MPO's model.
And that's a really good point, because things are growing so quickly around here that we have an existing conditions report. This is a very fast study for a PEL. We've gotten through it very quickly. But even that, our existing conditions report, you have to put a hard stop on it, because people keep, you know, well, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, and that's fantastic. But at some point, we have to say that's, you know, that was our existing conditions, now we're moving forward. So to your point, yeah, there will be adjustments, obviously, when, you know, development comes up, especially when it comes up not as anticipated by NFR MPO. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we have 2040 projections. Should it be a little different? Well, that's gonna change things a little bit.
I'm smarking a little bit because I'm the consultant that had to react to all those changes and we finally said no more. And
It's an easy phone call for me.
October 2017 is our end of our existing conditions, and a lot has changed in the quarter since then. So new signals have been installed as an example.
But that is a good question, because that road could get very busy, even though it's a couple miles to the north on Crossroads. If people use that to get in,
Well, and the
That's
other,
the faster way out.
and 13's on the other end of it. So both of them are gonna get some volume. What is the process then for local input into what you were saying in terms of existing condition or some 2040 assumptions? Who in the town has that?
Tenure track member.
So,
Okay.
and then through your participation as part of the North Front Range NPO,
Yeah.
you have an opportunity to suggest things there too. Does that cover your question?
Thank you.
So kind of right out of the gate, as you know, as we had these TAC meetings and we were hearing from local agencies, it became really apparent that there were improvements in the corridor that we should really just do. And so we had a list of, I think we ended up with 17 of these projects. So they're addressing known problem areas, whether it's a safety or mobility or a turn lane or, you know, kind of the low-hanging fruit. So we've got a list of those that we can share with you. But by and large, those are kind of lower dollar, easier to implement type of projects. We did talk about a potential project phasing of the big picture items. So we had this big recommendation, right? We got 650 to $750 million of improvements needed in this corridor. But we're all realists here. We're not gonna get that money in one big chunk. We're gonna take 20 years to roll it out, and we really need to prioritize and target what's most important. So we did kind of the David Letterman top 10, and we realized that wasn't enough. We had to go to 15. So we have 15 kind of initial priority recommendations. And what I found really refreshing about this process was our tech membership was so engaged that it was all about the regional approach, right? How can we make US 34 better? Because we all have our own agendas within the corridor. We all have our own constituents that we're trying to meet those needs. But the bigger picture was, how can we fix 34? And so, what I found refreshing was, you know, our Greeley partners and our Weld County partners to the east recognized that the widening of 34 in Loveland was important. It was a previous recommendation from an EIS or an EA, and those needs are still there. So those are kind of the first initial priorities, if you will. And then the interchange projects kind of trickle after that. So Weld County Road 13 being one, Weld County Road 17 being another in your area.
Are those ranked by order or just the numbers just designate?
So at least right now, this is our initial, what we're calling our initial prioritization. But I think there's a lot of flexibility here. So our initial prioritization list was based on safety, mobility, funding availability was another one. So we might want to build what I'll call the viaduct from I-25 over to Centera, you know, over the railroad that Dave was describing. There's 3 interchanges and a railroad crossing in there. It's $330 million. So that one kind of slipped on the list because if you do one, you really have to do all 3.
Right.
So
They become one project.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
So the reality of trying to get $330 million and it all going to that project just made that project slip.
Now, and it's a good point too, because this isn't a hard and fast list, right? So we've softened a little bit because, I mean, we're engineers, right? We love to have numbers of which one we're gonna do first and everything, but realistically, there's a lot of political pressure that informs this too, right? And then should development come up, like I was saying, unanticipated or in a place that we weren't anticipating, things are gonna change. So this is kind of a soft list of the priority of projects that we have now. So should a local come with funding for a different project and be really interested in moving that forward, well, yeah, that's gonna increase in priority because it's just easier to find funding when, you know, match is there.
And how much did this, because there were several citizens meetings that were held along the way.
Yeah.
How much of that input got translated into what actually the final plan was and how, and then what is their process to being presented, like what the final outcome is? Because I know at the last one that I was at, there was a lot of unhappy folks who you got that core group who've been following all of those citizen meetings, and I've been to like 3 of them, so they're that, and they kind of felt like they kept voicing, but every time they came, they hadn't seen their thought or idea, and so a bunch of us said, then it's important then that at least we address, hey, some folks wanted this, but here's why it's not feasible, or why we can't do it, or why this idea is better. Or at what point are they gonna be put back into the,
So within the PEL process, there's no, with the exception of public involvement that you've described, there's no formal, you know, public hearing like there might be for an NEPA process. That's to come later. But we did get over 100 comments that will be integrated as part of the study. In addition to, we're actually gonna list those. We've redacted all the personal
Good,
information.
okay.
We're gonna list
That will
those
help.
as an appendix within our public involvement report. So we hope that through the 3 series of public meetings that we have had, that we have been hearing that feedback, and that our alternatives are reflective of that. So as an example, I don't have a slide for it in this deck, but Morning Drive was an area out in Loveland that was a very, very vocal neighborhood group. They got on next door and they got a lot of people to our public meetings. And so we ended up preserving a couple of different options at those intersections, just to give that future NEPA team a little more flexibility, so that we weren't, quote, putting the nail in the coffin, that we were closing their access or changing.
Well, that would be good that if we just even have those that folks can see, so-
Right.
because I think that's important that they see that their message was made, right? And it was noted somewhere
Yeah.
in the process.
Yep, I fully agree. And kind of a nice part about this is we are done when we start looking at alternatives. That's all the further we have to, I mean, it's the fun, right? It's the fun part of engineering, the high level without having to get too into the weeds with everything. So the public response and the public interaction, when these become actual projects as opposed to concepts, which they are right now, that's when that kicks off in earnest. And that's when there's, yeah.
So we wouldn't tell the citizens this, but in the back room, we always talk about kind of how to perceive some of this public input that we're receiving. And it's often in the PEL process, it's don't think about what their comment is, they should really be thinking about what it is for their kids or for their grandkids. Because projects take time to develop, right? It might be 10 or 15 years before a real project hits the streets. And so that's,
Okay.
you know, how it impacts them is not as important as it is for their kids or their grandkids.
Okay.
So here's that list just in text form. We can roll out some plots if you wish to do that, but the big one of interest to this team is probably the construction of the interchange at Little County Road 17. So we had a lot of interchange recommendations within the corridor. That was one that was near the top of the initial priority list. So we had this in our deck when we met with Coalition. I don't know how much detail we want to go in here, but one of the kind of parallel processes that we were charged with was evaluating risk within the corridor. And obviously with the 2013 floods, it became apparent that our infrastructure needs to be more resilient to man-made and natural type of threats. So we went through this process of identifying threats within the corridor and where those threats overlaid with assets that CDOT owns, whether it's a bridge or a major utility or a railroad or whatever. Some of those obviously you guys don't own, but we're still considered assets. We developed this list of risk areas, We had 25 of them throughout the corridor, and the primary ones again were the flood potential at major structures, utility failures that were considered large utilities, and then those railroad crossings.
So importantly on these don't necessarily represent a standalone project. What these are is, if we're doing a project at one of these locations, should really consider the resilient opportunity in there. You know, you spend a little bit, Boss, you could talk a little bit about that bridge out there.
So for an example of this, in the infancy of this effort, would have been during the 2013 floods, that we had a section of 34 that washed out east of Greeley. We have a big bridge over the main channel of the river. Well, about a mile east of that, we had a 600-foot hole in our roadway. And there's no floodplain there. There's no mapped floodplain there. And so the question came down, and the feds paid for about 80% of all of our repairs. And so we build everything to standards. The foundation of all the work that we do is standards that have been established throughout the industry. For example, that will make sure that a bridge can cross a 100-year floodplain. If it's a 150-year flood and your bridge goes underwater, that's acceptable. So we draw these baselines and create the standard. Well, out there, we didn't have a floodplain. There wasn't even an existing bridge there previously. All the arrows would have been pointing back towards just rebuild the roadway the way it was, and just put it back in place again and get on down the road. Well, they evaluated this risk, natural risk, resiliency was coming out at that time. The feds, because we've been getting, there's been quite a few natural disasters in the U.S. and the cost is getting crazy to keep rebuilding things all the time. So basically through the analysis, they looked at the detour routes, the impacts to emergency services and so on and so forth, and they just basically agreed with CDOT that it was worthwhile to put a bridge where there wasn't a bridge, and to accommodate something greater than a 100-year flood. And so, using these as an example, you know, in the future, we've got a couple more bridges that are showing over the Big Thompson, so the one on the west end of the corridor comes to mind. If that bridge was, and that's built for 100 years now, if that bridge were to get wiped out in the next flood, when it was rebuilt, they would probably reconsider that, maybe to reconstruct it with a little more resiliency. And they would use these types of evaluations. So in the PEL, what we're doing is we're pointing out to future people, because we're not doing a study for ourselves, we're doing this for the future employees of CDOT, to pick up on what you're saying there, Zeke. And so future teams would look at it and say, oh, this has been identified as a risk, a natural risk, and we need to take that into account when we put back the structure. Or if that bridge were to come up for reconstruction, even if it wasn't wiped out by a flood, they would look at it and say, okay, we know that there's a problem here, the next structure is gonna be more resilient. So that's kind of how they would apply that.
Any questions about risk?
Great idea.
We could, boy, I hesitate to get into it, but we could mention also the operational resiliency effort that's going on. So when you look at risk and resiliency, there's natural, which is really easy to understand and to explain, and that's great. And then there's operational risk and resiliency, which is a little more tenuous and it's hard to get your hands and your head around. But what it has to do with basically is that unforeseen development that we've been talking about, right? So should this happen here when we're not expecting it? Should this zoning change here when we're not expecting it? Correct, you were at a meeting today, correct me where I start to go askew, will you?
I will.
Yeah, I know you will. I appreciate that. Yeah, so it, as a parallel but separate effort to this, what we're going to do is put together this this tool that primarily our permits guy Tim Billebrand over at CDOT will use to in communication with the communities to be able to proactively identify where these things are going to take place. And head off some of the scrambling to fix. Okay, so we're beating Greeley up over this, but we keep using 83rd Avenue. You guys very familiar with 83rd Avenue down there? Giant development went in, and it was just far enough. Again, please redirect me if I do. It's just. You're redirecting me already.
No.
Okay. It was just far enough off the corridor that we didn't require a traffic impact analysis, traffic impact study. Yeah, TIS. And it turned out that it drastically increased traffic on 34. And now we have a signal up there on a cable over the top of the highway.
Thank God.
Not, yeah, right, really, but it's not the way that we want to do business. So in an effort to avoid that in the future, there's this tool that we're using that's kind of a communication tool. It's still evolving in what it's going to look like, but we're having one-on-one meetings with each of the communities, and that will include Windsor. We have a consultant, Moeller, on board, so they help with some of this effort with the natural risk and resiliency, and they'll be moving forward with that. So that will be happening quickly because we want to get this document together. It's not going to be a huge burdensome thing, but it will be something that will continue to be updated every 5 years. NFRMPO, right, puts out their new projections. So every 5 years we'd be revisiting this and seeing, okay, what's changed from what we thought? How are we going to deal with this differently? Everybody's very excited about it. I think it's going to be a really good situation, but it is happening right now. It's not the PEL, it's complementary to.
Is there a responsibility on the community part? Suppose a new development came up next week, and we didn't know what it was. Should we be contacting you and letting you know about it, or?
In my mind, the earliest such things can be communicated, the better. I mean,
And
for
Johnny's
everybody.
made it very clear that anything and everything that, I mean, even if there's a hint, if there's a project or something that we think is coming, we need to let CDOT know. I mean, especially if it's in terms of any proximity to any key important corridors. They need to be, they wanna know sooner rather than later, and then if they never happen, then they never happen, but they'd rather know early on if they can.
And so this tool then will allow us to compare the projections, so the North Front Range NPO, we use their population projections, so their 2040 projections. If whatever's happening is going to, say, make that happen faster or in excess of what those projections were, it'll give CDOT an idea and the communities an idea of how it will impact the corridor. And so, for example, I mean, everybody's lamenting what happened at County Road 13. And I don't think anybody expected, and I don't wanna be naive, I'm mostly involved in construction and engineering, I'm not traffic operations. But, you know I drive that corridor every day, and the backups there have been just, at times, amazing, brutal, yeah. So it would just give us the opportunity to be able to know or have an idea that that was gonna happen before we actually got there. It just creates our ability to have a good conversation with the communities, and, you know, CDOT's, our charge is to maintain, you know, mobility. And so, you know, sometimes these things can really impact mobility. I guess CDOT just wants to make sure that we're able to have a rational conversation about the impacts before
Right.
anybody's ever spent any money at all. And there's no real enforcement teeth with that or anything else, it just goes back to we're all partners. The public doesn't know where one governmental agency stops and the other one picks up for the most part,
Right.
so.
So Mayor, to go back to a point that you made just a minute ago about communication and the level of communication, I think the more the better, and I think that better prepares CDOT. But I think one thing that we have heard from our coalition membership, and certainly from our TAC group, was that with the formation of the US 34 Coalition, that communication about the importance and needs along the 34 corridor are much better than they were even just before the study began. So I think that we should, I think as a project team, we should take credit for helping shepherd that along a little bit. And our hope is that the US 34 Coalition, long after I'm gone and Chad's moved on to other projects at CDOT, that the coalition perpetuates, and they have a mission now, and their mission is to solve and help improve 34.
That's a
Well,
great
and find
point.
funding
Yeah,
would be the
find
next
funding.
mission.
Yeah,
Right.
and so it's my job to implement, our major corridor is actually 85, the unit that I work in. We were asked to manage this project, but, and I can tell you that, so we've been living with the 85 PL now for a couple of years. And the 85 Coalition, they've reduced their meeting schedule, but they're key to success out there. You know, being able to get everybody around the table once every other month and talk about what's going on in the corridor and sort of build consensus for what's going on along the corridor I think is very important moving forward. We have a group of people, we need to amend the access control plan. We have that group of people that are used to meeting, we're used to talking about 85. That effort's been going on now, I think 8 years, or 7 or 8 years.
And it was begun in
It was
in
begun
coordination
for the
with
PEL, and it's continued after the PEL was completed to facilitate the projects along the corridor and facilitate the development along the corridor.
Well, and you're really triggering to one question I have that's not exactly about this PEL, but it's a question of, you know, we have Highway 392, we have Highway 257. What metrics does CDOT use to say, okay, this highway's big enough to warrant kind of this kind of study, this level of study? What would it take to get a PEL on like 392?
I mean, let me try. I think the best, I think you guys are there, actually. I don't know if 392's been studied or not in the past, but I think reaching out to Johnny and your MPO.
There's an environmental assessment a few years ago, and an access control plan, but not a PEL that I know of.
There's an access control plan on 392? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, PEL is a relatively new thing, for lack of a better term, and it was the feds that came up with it. It was
That doesn't make it a bad idea.
No, well, but I mean, I would highly recommend, I know right now we're analyzing other corridors for inclusion in the PEL studies. I know 52 is one of the ones that's in consideration right now. Dr. Cog has asked CDOT Region 4 to take a look at that. And I don't think there's any reason why the North Front Range MPO or the mayor, or council could, same thing, make the request to Johnny. I think the whole point is trying to get ahead of problems before they occur.
Right.
And I
I
think all
would
of
just
these
add-
corridors in northern Colorado are gonna see continual pressure from development. There's a lot of undeveloped land up here, a lot of opportunities.
We're seeing pressure now,
Yeah.
at least in Windsor. I'm sure every community would like to say that, but we're experiencing a massive growth up here, maybe percentage-wise greater than what other communities around us are, because we have a lot of the land available for development. Is all in Windsor, and that's why 17
Yeah, we've got a
and
couple.
17.
Okay.
I'm sorry, maybe the mayor's got something.
I just wanna make sure they had gotten through the presentation,
So-
cause we've got about only about 3 more minutes.
2 minutes. I think where we want to wrap up is, we've gotten a lot of really good support from all the local entities along the corridor, as we mentioned. And in fact, at our last coalition TAC meeting, we pretty much got, it's either through letters of support or more often through either city or county resolutions. Those entities that have participated in our study are planning on providing that for our backup on our project. So if Windsor was so inclined, we would welcome either a council resolution and or a letter of support for the recommendations from our study.
So we provided a template of the letter of support, if that's the direction that you guys would be interested in going, but you see where this is going, and the most support we can get from the locals, the more credibility it lends to the document, and the more weighty it is as you move forward.
I don't know why we wouldn't support that. I think, 34 is a key major corridor, as it makes a lot of our other connections, you know, on the north and south side, so. If you want to, send that on to our town manager, we can forward it and
Be happy to do
where it
that.
needs to go, then we can all.
Quick question,
Go ahead.
just yes or no, we don't need to elaborate. I seem to recall that Windsor put in extra money to have Crossroads studied as part of this, and I think someone put in money for 402 to be studied as part of this on the south. Is that
I'm not-
true?
I don't think we ended up allocating
Okay,
dollars
I
for
just
that.
seen-
Miles.
For 402?
No, for Crossroads,
Crossroad.
to be part of
I
the study.
thought,
No, okay.
well, so what we wanted to do is, when we put out our RFP, we wanted to analyze the impacts of Crossroads traffic on 34 when 34 broke down.
Right.
And everybody ran to Crossroads.
Okay.
And vice versa, when Crossroads break down and when development occurred along Crossroads, then all those people went to 34. But
Okay.
that's the extent at which we studied Crossroads. And the same
So there
thing with
was some,
402
but-
kind of wrote the
I
time.
thought
We
we put
did.
in money.
We talked about that, I
Okay.
think there was an opportunity for other communities to add things to the
Yeah.
PEL as, if they wanted to.
And there still probably is.
But,
Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly.
okay,
Well, thank you all very much for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to meet you guys, thank you very much.
very much.
Thanks so much, Luke, appreciate it.
Yeah, and really,
Interesting.
Talking.
blue and white, your navy blue and white shirts for the parade. For those of you that are gonna be in the parade on Monday, okay? You know which ones those are?
The dark blue,
The
it's
the
dark.
blue with the white on the
Why
side,
do you look at me?
not the.
Teal is the other.
Thank you, CDOT.
You guys are changing, you're gonna change it as soon as I walk out, you go.
Absolutely, yeah. Whatever you need, thanks.
So,
Do you guys have a
Hey,
card?
Kim.
I think
Do you have a
great
card
if
with
we
you?
just have a little bit more of a,